Thank you for joining us. Here in the studio, we have two guests to discuss the findings of the study called Understanding Barriers to Women and Youth Political Participation in Mongolia. Could we start with self-introductions? We're starting with you.
Sure, thank you. My name is Burtujing. I'm a senior program manager working at the International Republican Institute.
Well, I'm glad to be discussing the findings of this report. My name is Ichchol. I'm the founder and CEO of Educated Enterprise. We've had the pleasure and privilege to work on this research alongside with IRI.
Let's start with the juicy part of the study. Ms. Ichchol, can you tell us what were the most surprising findings from this study?
Surprising. Well, in terms of the real life examples, some of the survey participants, especially the focus group discussants and interviewees shared with us were quite interesting and surprising to us in some ways. Although we heard about a lot of rumors or a lot of happenings around the behind the scenes of election campaigning and how voters were behaving and also how the candidates were also participating in the elections. I can probably name one or two examples. So especially some of the examples from the rural areas were quite interesting. There's a term in Mongolian that says "tsartsadal," but in English it can be translated as like grass hopping. So what it means is that because of the relatively low number of population in Mongolia, then especially those who have the age already able to vote, it's relatively low, right? Of course, the whole population is a little bit over 3 million. So every vote matters, especially in smaller soms or bags, those are equivalent to villages in the countryside. So for the nationwide parliamentary elections, for example, there has been a lot of incidents where when a bus full of people were migrated from urban areas to rural areas, so that they can affect the final result in those areas. So, and it already has a terminology called grass hopping. So, it was interesting when the real life election organizers on the ground were sharing about this, and also, some of the quite tricky, tools, some maybe that were in practice in the rural areas. But maybe, I think this is what I can recall as surprising moments. But of course, there are like interesting facts that when we were compiling the overall results, I think it's probably better to also talk about the overall findings rather than pointing out the real, maybe worst examples. So I can just share this grass hopping for now, and maybe let's hear what Burt found interesting, and I can move on with some of the findings. Yeah.
Sure. This study is a part of a grander project being carried out by the International Republican Institute, right? And the project is titled Strengthening Women and Youth Engagement in the Electoral Process in Mongolia. So could you tell us a little bit behind the project and why you found it necessary to have this study conducted?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So as you said, it's under this overall program, which we call SWYEEPPM, which is a really attractive name for our very lengthy, names.
Acronyms are very important.
Yeah, exactly. So SWYEEPPM program, right? Strengthening, the entire purpose is literally spelled out in the name of the program. What we want to do is we want to strengthen women and youth engagement in the electoral and political processes in Mongolia. Now, the program is funded by the USAID, and we, IRI, implemented together with the Asia Foundation. Now, it's a 3-year, very dynamic program, and we use a very holistic way of trying to engage women and youth better. Now, the reason why I say it's a very dynamic, it's because if I take a step back and look at it, I think we engage, obviously, with the women and youth as voters, as public, right? And then we also engage with politicians, people in the parliament and government. But then in the middle, we also engage with civil society and media. We're trying to build very functional linkage between women and youth and the people in power who are making decisions or who are developing policies. Now, because of that, we try to, we have a variety of activities to build accountability, to build interest of people to go out and vote, to be politically more politically engaged. But then at the same time, we also, because we work with politicians and people in, elected officials, we try to provide them with resources that are going to be helpful for them. For example, very evidence-based or trustworthy information, such as findings from the research that we are talking about today. Now, another aspect that I want to say is this research is called She Votes. Now, She Votes is a tool that IRI's Women's Democracy Network created. It's basically a toolkit that looks into different kinds of barriers that women face as they politically engage. Now, because of our program, we edited it a little bit to make it more applicable to Mongolia as well as to our program. So we included youth in there. Now, this toolkit was tested in different countries, such as Tunisia and Georgia, and we were really interested in conducting it in Mongolia because, like 5 years ago, I personally was also involved in a similar research, and it was really interesting to us. And so what I wanted to find out personally was whether there has been any change in some of the barriers that women face, whether things have changed in the past 5 years or not. So this toolkit tries to have that holistic also or more comprehensive look at the barriers, more structured one. So we try to look at the governmental aspect of the barriers. We try to look at the societal barriers and also at individual barriers.
So have you found any difference from 5 years before in terms of the findings? Just curious.
Well, the differences, yes, I believe so. But it was more of similarities that surprised me. For example, 5 years ago, we also talked about how, for example, gender quota still, it's supposed to help women to be better engaged in politics and elections, but then it's viewed as a maximum ceiling instead of like a minimum threshold. So even 5 years later, or 4 years later, right, when we started conducting this research, it was surprising to see that it's still viewed the same way. Or some of the social stereotypes, they are still there, but I think it's improving a little bit. Maybe I could share an interesting finding that I found like 5 years ago. A team of researchers and ourselves at the IRI, we basically were deployed to different locations across the country. And I happened to go to Hoft province, and then I also led a lot of qualitative, conversations with participants here in Ulaanbaatar. Now, during one of my conversations, it was interesting to hear from a woman with vast experience running for office. Now, she told me that in the countryside, obviously in Gir, in the traditional yurts, it matters when you are a young person and a woman. If you're running for office and as a candidate, you're going out and meeting your potential voters and really explaining your agenda, your platform, And then the way the yurgul is set up is that we have kind of like a more respective position inside the home, right? As soon as you enter, if you are a respected person, you would obviously sit somewhere further away from the door, from the entrance. Now, this woman told us that as a candidate, she was greeted well and she would sit at the respected position. But then her opponents, who used a very tricky kind of tactic, they would have elderly people in their group, and they would have male, and they would come in after the woman enters. So naturally, the household, or like the voters, right, they would ask the elderly and the male to go out to the more respected position and change seats, which is interesting. Because as a candidate, what you want to do is you want to position yourself as a person who is respected, who's trustworthy, and who is like a leader, right? More present. Yes. Well, not necessarily authoritative, but yes, I see what your point, right?
More visually present to everyone, at least.
Exactly,
to start with.
Exactly. But then by that simple move of having a young woman change her seat from somewhere respectable to closer, to the entrance, you're saying that I'm gonna hear this person better than I'm gonna hear you. So tricks like that, it was so eye-opening to me because it never occurred to me.
Yeah, sounds like one of the societal barriers, that's really perpetuated in the Mongolian culture in terms of, how you present yourself, especially in the rural context when you are in the rural areas or in gear and also related cultural context. That's I think really true. Yeah, and I actually personally and our team found the She Votes methodology very comprehensive and also very, profound, because a lot of the barriers Bush mentioned, for example, are really perpetuated in the society. And the reason what we found was that, whenever we were talking to focus group discussants, researchers, or, even just doing the desk reviews, this topic is not totally new. I mean, it has been there for years, in terms of promoting gender equality and also promoting youth and women participation in the politics. But the reason why we kind of observed in terms of not making progress faster enough is probably the barriers have not been examined as thorough. I mean, of course, we're not trying to boast about our report, but we as local team who have worked with IRI, the international organization, who already, of course, developed and tested the methodology in other countries, is that our local team also have learned a lot because these kind of systemic problem needs to be really examined and looked through as comprehensive as possible. So we were glad to we were very glad to be able to look at this systemic problem through a lens that covers comprehensive areas, including the governmental, socio-cultural, and the individual level. Yeah. So maybe in terms of the findings, I said I would be sharing more later on. So maybe I can point out some of the findings that struck me as a person. So I mentioned about the grasshopping and also the grasshopping aspect, and also the campaign organization, and how the voters are really treated in many different ways with many different, tricky angles, is something that has escalated the campaigning costs. So this was pointed out as one of the top barriers for youth, young, and women politicians, especially to participate in the politics as active, and aspire to hold decision-making positions. So in terms of the campaign costs, so there was, for example, statistics that says that in the most recent election, 2020 parliamentary election, those who were elected to the parliament spent about 4 times more cost than those who were not elected. So it shows, to be precise, it was 3.6 times more than the average spending of those who were not elected. I mean, who ran for the elections but were not elected. So it shows, the more you spend, the higher chances of you getting elected. So it's kind of, in Mongolia, it's talked as campaigning politics is very much money-driven, finance-driven. So it is a very high barrier for youth and women to really participate and to run for the office. So this is something I can point out, and maybe Dudla has more questions on the findings.
Mongolia to me is a very interesting country when it comes to gender relations. Mongolia is still a very largely patriarchal society, which comes into play when it comes to political decision making. But there are certain statistics where women are much more in a better position. Women are much more educated. In some positions, there are much more women than there are men. But there's, especially in government, in the entry level and mid level, there's mostly women who are carrying the burden of running the government most of the time. But there's a certain line, especially at the upper level and decision-making level, where women somehow disappear, and which is something that I think in the findings you'll find that what happens when it comes to women when they reach a middle level position and they suddenly disappear. What happens in that situation?
I think that's where the sociocultural and individual barriers come in. Of course, women still carry the burden of household chores and the child care duties and family care duties most of the time, and that lead them to career break, of course, more than men. And a lot of the time also women lack the support of their family in terms of aspiring for, top-level positions, decision-making level, because decision-making positions require more time in the office for their career. So, they would have to compromise their time. They would spend for their family to spend in the office. So, it's not only a decision that women make on their own, but they have to, consult with their family and their relatives and their closer circle. And not only the family, but also in terms of the findings, the society overall still carry these conventional gender roles. So they assume that men are more suitable for leadership positions or the politics, but women are more suitable for, steady office jobs. That's why the study findings also showed us that, for example, in the political parties, in the major political parties, 70% of the administrative jobs are done by women. So, all the daily works are done by women, but when it comes to the decision-making level, setting the policy and the strategy, there's hardly any women. So there is the gender imbalance. But we have been talking about these barriers from the women as politicians, I think, for political aspirants. But if we maybe look at it as also voters, it's not as bad in maybe compared to other countries.
And if I may add more, this really speaks to some of the findings that we included in the research. There's this perception that women are more implementers and executors instead of like leaders at decision-making level, which doesn't help. Now, when you talk to women, right, especially women in politics, trying to find out and analyze the problems that they're facing. Oftentimes we hear they're great at their job, they know how to do things, they do most of the work, but then when it comes to
Give the credit,
reporting, right? Reporting or reporting back to the decision, higher level people, or to the public, or to the media. It's usually the people that we see behind the table at a press conference, for example, is very limited. We need diversity. Now, therefore, in some of our recommendations in the report, we say that we need gender sensitivity in civil society and media as well. Now, we also, there are obviously a lot of factors, right, that contribute to what you and Zola have just talked about. So another factor that really contributes to why, right, women seem to be like right behind at the backbone, but they're not really at the decision making at the top, is because of what we call kind of boys clubbing when it comes to making important decisions. Now, what I mean by that is, oftentimes in politics and also in other sectors, people seem to make important decisions while like getting together after work over a drink or two. And when it comes to women, they self-censor themselves because they don't want to be involved in those kind of activities every single day.
Or after work. Yeah?
After work. And so there's a lot of things that contribute to it. And one of our recommendations, again, was that it's a recommendations for political parties and institutions like that to really kind of try to standardize decision-making processes in a way that are gender sensitive.
Yeah, and also promote the culture of making the decisions, work-related decisions during work hours. I mean, of course, I think it will take some time, but at least if some of the political parties and some of the political leaders within the parties start talking about this and start realizing it, especially the male ones, I think, the change will happen quicker. And that is also, included in our recommendations alongside with other types of support that the political parties can provide to their young and women members, as well as the youth and women in general who are interested in getting involved in the politics. So the other, another recommendation, for example, is about this mentorship program. And also different kinds of career-related programs that can make the roadmap, the career trajectory for the young and women politicians more clear. Because at the moment, the dominant culture within the political parties, especially the two older ones in Mongolia, are quite unstructured, similar to what Burt said, in a way that is really, decided by certain group of leaders, but not, structured something as an organizational culture. So we're hoping that, with this kind of projects, this kind of efforts, this realization will take place among the political leaders and the political party leaders, I guess more than before. So that's the kind of change we're hoping to see in the coming years also,
Me personally, I believe in a representative democracy. Your elected officials should reflect what the voters look like, right? And statistically, we have roughly 50-50 male and female population, right? And also, in Mongolia, it might not be the same in other countries, but women vote more than men. I think it was a big difference, maybe perhaps 60%, 40% difference, right? Women vote more, but
slightly more,
in the decision-making level, you still see not enough women. So, but I think we maybe need to step back a little bit and explain why we need more women in the decision-making level. What difference is that going to make? But I think we have enough research to show that if you have more women represented in company boards, as well as in the public sector, decisions are much more, and the results are much more sustainable, right? So could you explain why, a little bit behind the project, and why we need you are trying to increase women in the decision-making level?
Right, if I can just, I don't know, highlight maybe my top 3 reasons for why. One is obviously, just like you said, we women are half or more than, a little bit more than half of the population. Now, when you are not being included in the decision-making level, and your voices are not being heard, and your opinion is not reflected in policies that will affect your life, then it's a huge bummer. It's a matter of not kind of responding to the needs and demands and issues of half of the country. Secondly, in a similar way, I mean, Mongolia is a very youth-oriented country. I mean, youth, if you look at the statistics, right? If you include the kids and everybody up to the age of 40, literally 71%, I think, according to our national statistics, are young people. But if you have all of your decisions being made by people who don't really represent you, but then those decisions affect more than 70% of the entire country's population, that's problematic. Now, another thing is that it's not only about representation, it's about diversity of opinion. You want to make sure that you want to think from the point of view of how policies are affecting people in real life. When you have those stakeholders, right, be included in that kind of process, you're going to look at things from a more diverse perspective. You're not going to, the chance of missing out on important things will be fewer.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why I'd like to reiterate the point that, this study looked at youth and women as one, voters, and 2, as political system active participants, either as politicians or political party members, or someone who is actively participating in the political process in general. So I think the reason why we have been emphasizing more on the latter, which is more, having young and women politicians in decision making, is this is more how would I say, pressing issue in Mongolia. If you just look at the current percentage of women parliamentarians in Mongolia, it's only 17%, and we are relatively behind. We're quite behind the Asia-Pacific average 24% of women representatives in the parliament. Although, as you pointed out, we have more, statistically, we have more women voting in the elections, the outcome is not as equivalent. So there is, of course, the structural or the governmental barrier, such as the quota, that is not being in place properly, as Burt pointed out earlier. But also there is a lack of voter education, voter belief in why there should be more gender awareness, gender sensitivity, as well as inclusivity, being more aware of inclusivity in terms of age. Hence, we pointed out lack of systematic voter education is one of our findings. I'm glad that, through our discussion, we've been able to actually cover almost all of the main findings. We were able to retrieve through the report, yeah. And in terms of the voter education, also we have included certain recommendations specifically addressed to the General Election Committee. So we were hoping that we would also follow up. IRA, the project team would follow up with these entities, institutions, in terms of really having them be aware of the findings and discuss about the recommendations also.
Yeah, Muhtala, if I can, add one more point is that, as Zola mentioned, right, the General Election Commission, and we have recommendations for it and things like that, but it was so, positive to see at least verbal commitment from the General Election Commission that say that they want to start conducting voter education, very comprehensive voter education activities, not only right before the elections, but also every year, like in a very continuous way. So that was really interesting. And as a matter of fact, I also want to add another item that I'm personally very kind of proud, which is people with disability, right? PWD. In Mongolia this year, we had first ever PWD-led election observation mission. It was really amazing. And as a person who's working on a program, SWYEEPPM, who was able to support that mission to conduct their activity and reach their objective, it was really kind of fulfilling to see that. I think we are in a good kind of positive trajectory, but at the same time, there are a lot of things that need to take place, obviously.
Well, situation, the overall gender situation might be getting better in some aspects, but in certain aspects, politically especially, we see some setbacks, especially in legal terms. The election law or the states that 20% of the candidates needs to be women, but it's a setback from 30%, which was I think 2012 when we first introduced the law on gender equality, which affected the election law as well. And in the findings, in the study, as well as I think both of you mentioned that the 20% quota is being seen as the maximum ceiling of women candidates.
Opposite of the intention, yeah?
Opposite of the intention, and which forces political parties to, let's say, bare minimum of 20%, and then the other 80% is up for grabs for men.
Unfortunate.
The law might be 20%, but I think it also in the recommendations it says that political parties themselves should set an example and see 20% as a minimum requirement, not a maximum ceiling, and set the example for future political candidacy, and actively mentor and find women candidates for politicians, right? For elections.
Yeah, so just to probably share is my last point. There's also related to the high campaigning costs I shared, in addition to this, governmental, legal barriers, the structural, barriers that are related to the social, cultural aspects, is that due to many reasons, one being the high cost of the campaigning, and also second being, the political parties, how would I say, work as closed networks everywhere. And whenever there are public positions announced, it's usually taken up by someone who belongs to the political party that is in power at that moment. So these kind of examples really influence the society, especially the young people, to think, to take politics as dirty. So maybe the low interest, maybe sometimes, or low, how would I say, not intention, but taking low responsibility to be active citizens, and not trying to be maybe the politicians themselves, but to be active in the election process, and maybe studying their candidates responsibly. Is related to having, okay, the politics is there, it's really dirty, with or without me, it has been like this. So this notion is also really badly affecting the low turnout of young voters in the elections. We found out through our findings. Yeah, so that's something I also wanted to point out, since we've been talking about the barriers for young and women, mostly as politicians, but as for voters as well. Yeah, there are certain aspects that were taken into consideration, and that we hope to also raise awareness through our findings and also in our recommendations. So one of that is, for example, the walk to education, and we're glad that some further steps are being made to address that issue. Yeah.
Exactly, and in regard to the gender quota, like you said, right? If you look at the history, it's been very kind of unfortunate. It seems like every election year, Mongolia has been amending the elections law. There's been a lot of uncertainty, and the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty is a barrier in itself to especially newcomers, especially to women and young people who have limited resources, trying to plan out their campaigns or planning to be politically more engaged. So things like that need to be addressed. I mean, it cannot continue forever.
Well, like you said, I think I won't be mistaken to say that every election, the election law changes, whether it's parliamentary, local, or presidential election. I think we never miss an election where the election law hasn't changed. And with that election law change, it's a big change all the time, whether it's political election system, majority system, or proportion system, or is it a multi-seat district or not. And like you said, it's very hard to plan for the election. It's very hard to choose your district where you want to run, right? Whether it's a small district or it's a big district. Big difference on how much money you'll need to raise or how much time you need to prepare to run in the election, right? Like you said. As perhaps the last point, I'd like to. This is not there's no silver bullet that's going to change the situation where we have more women in the political process and the decision making. But among the findings, I'd like to ask you which I think might be your favorite, and which might be the most effective, and which might affect the other results as well, and which would you like to change first to see more an impactful change in the gender equality in the decision making?
Zola earlier mentioned the word dirty, right? Now, as a woman and as one of the young people in Mongolia, you do see that word a lot, right? And it wasn't one of our findings. People seem to think politics is dirty or messy, or there's a lot of debates going on. It's too hot for me to be involved. My reputation is going to be ruined, or things like that. But what I really like to, in response to all of the things, because you asked what you hope will change, right? My hope is that people will change their viewpoint on that word. The reason why we afford to have this very debatable, very hot, and very kind of loud politics is because we have a democratic and open society. And it's important to kind of acknowledge that, because if you were not given the opportunity to share your opinion without having to censor yourself, it would be a whole different dilemma, whole different level of barrier.
Exactly. Yeah.
So in an effort to really kind of be politically involved, to make sure that your future and others' futures will be better presented to you, you want to be involved in politics, whether it's running for office or going out and vote or talking to your representatives. And as a matter of fact, in our program, we also have a component called collaborative public policy making. Now, what we try to do is all the policies that are affecting us need to be developed in a way where there's a diversity in the people in the room, whether it's the politicians or the parliamentarians or local elected officials, the think tanks, the researchers, the whoever, subject matter experts, but also women and youth, the PWD, the elderly. Everybody needs to be included in that decision-making voice, and I hope that people will leverage that, and they are not going to censor themselves on their own. I hope that there will be a cultural shift where people will be fully and confidently proud of their participation. And we've seen a little bit of that in 2020. So I think there's a hope.
Yeah. I would really like to end this with this positive note that Purt started. I mean, although there are many barriers, not only in the political participation of youth and women, but just in general, every country has their own obstacles in different areas. We are a thriving democratic society, and that's something we should be really proud of, and that's something, especially the young people really should treasure and try to take individual responsibility in terms of making it better, maybe fixing the barriers and, being active in the political process. It does not have to be, maybe go on strike or it's the simple things that you two mentioned, in terms of maybe being responsive when you are your opinions are sought after, and being active when your votes matter, and also being proud of being able to maybe represent certain groups that you belong to. So with the barriers identified, which we hope that we were able to touch upon quite comprehensive topics, and also try to look into the profound reasons why these barriers are faced by youth and women. This report sheds light on very, I think, important aspects, especially the ones that are really entrenched in the system. So we really hope that as local team that are involved in the research team, that the recommendations will be picked up by the relevant bodies, relevant institutions, and the follow-up actions will be taken. I think if such kind of actions are taken at the individual and the organizational and the decision-making level, we can see the impact, the positive change already by 2024. So I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to see some positive change, tangible results continuing from this report. And also there are other projects and other programs that are also working on this issue, especially in gender equality and decision making. So I think, in Mongolia, it's really picked up as one of the essential topics. So hopefully, more and more people will be aware of it and will start contributing at very, with their hands-on approach. Yeah, not only just talking, but really participating. Tangible. Yeah, and to bring up the tangible results. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for having us, and I'm very glad that we were able to talk about this. And I think maybe in terms of the report, maybe if somebody wants to read the whole report, they can access on the IRI website and. Right?
Right, exactly. Not on the IRI website, but on the Facebook page of the IRI in Mongolia. And I'm sure you will also put it out there on your organization's Educated, social media. And
if I may add my own favorite finding from the report, which is the high cost of campaigning, right? As Zola mentioned. The other barriers, cultural, traditional. Is
it your most favorite or least favorite finding?
Least favorite, the one that I want to change the most, right?
Right.
Cultural and maybe traditional barriers will take time, right? These don't change over in one election cycle. But a law can be changed in one session, right? So I want to make elections much more cheaper so that young people and women can at least with a small fundraising campaign, be able to fully fund their own small little district council election or little bug election or even a horo election, right? So I think that could be easily, or if there's a political will within the parliament, that in 4 years before the next election cycle, that we can change the election law. And the law on political parties is up for discussion in the autumn session as well. So I think with enough maybe social and civil pressure, if we give the parliament enough pressure, maybe they'll be able to pass something that is much more sensible and much more fundable and easily fundable in the next election cycle.
Yeah, that's why actually media and civil society are also included as one of the important
subject matters
subject matters in the recommendations, exactly. So we hope that other relevant parties, yeah, like the media, different kinds of media, not only the traditional media, but the social media channels, influencers. There are many other emerging influencers as well. They will understand the importance of this kind of change and work together, yeah.
Right, and it's not only like actual laws, but also political parties' bylaws that could be improved further. For example, maybe take out the pledge money as a requirement for a lot of candidates. So yeah.
Political
Hopeful.
parties can be the front runners and show by example what needs to be done in the actual legal.
For sure.
laws
And they could even have
regulations.
voluntary higher level of gender quota.
Exactly.
They don't have to have the minimum, which is
Exactly.
law.
Yeah. Let's hope for the best then. Yeah.
I think we have enough evidence, research out there in the world that shows that more women participating in the decision-making level brings out much better results, results that are much more sustainable, that live much more, shelf life is much more longer, and that affects positively the whole population. And the trend, the global trend is heading that way as well. We see much more successful and developed countries with much more women in
And
their
youth.
decision-making level. And I think enough research showed that there's a direct link between that as well. More women in decision-making level, the more economy, politically, socially, a country prospers as well. And I think Mongolia should not be behind this global trend. And I think we should have an opportunity with the help of our international partners and organizations to show that, be an example as well, not just in the region as well, but in the world, to show that Mongolia can lead by example by having more women and much
Youth?
more young people as well
Exactly.
in politics and in the decision-making level at all sectors as well, not just public and private as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity with our small population and decisions that can happen much more quicker in parliament or in any level. We can be a good and positive example and really be that shining beacon of democracy that our politicians like to brag about in public stages. So thank you, ladies, and hope you'll make time to read the report. That we found some very interesting findings, and I think especially political parties, I think, like Berta said, can lead by example, not just wait for the law to change. And for the current members of parliament, I think a lot of responsibilities on their shoulders as well, because major laws need to be changed to meet with the new constitutional amendment. So let's work together to put more pressure on our parliamentarians. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you.